You know the line, history repeats itself. Well, our next guest wrote a book about a moment that, oh God, it's just so similar to now. John Nichols is the national affairs correspondent at The Nation magazine, of course, and he is the author of many books. The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party is the one that I'm talking about right now. Fun fact, I met you for the first time, John. You probably definitely don't remember this. Over 10 years ago when you wrote that book about journalism. I don't have it in front of me right now.
Death and Life of American Journalism.
That was it. Yeah. It was a brilliant book. I definitely recommend it to folks to take a look at it. But you were on a book tour and I met you in line and I talked to you for a little bit and I don't remember what I said and I don't remember what you said, but I knew I liked you.
Well, and we've been together in a lot of circumstances over the years. I think especially of the summits that were put together by National Nurses United, and some of these really powerful events where you saw a lot of progressives, and you were always and have always been such a good presence.
Thank you. I appreciate that, John. So, oh God, the timing of this book is brilliant. It's almost like you saw this coming. Okay, so the Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, this is something that I've personally been involved in, in so many ways in the last few years with the Sanders campaign on the Unity Reform Commission at the DNC. And here we are, Bernie Sanders is not the nominee anymore, or not the nominee at all, and the party is really doing what it does well, ignoring progressives once again. As we sit at this moment, Joe Biden has very credible, corroborated allegations, Me Too allegations against him, sexual assault allegations from a former aide. The mainstream media, corporate media, is now picking up on it, and there's silence from women's groups. There's silence from a lot of folks, except for maybe some key surrogates or people who want to be vice president, saying that essentially that they don't believe her. So I think it's really tough right now for progressives and feminists to digest this all and say, okay, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden because, Donald Trump has cut the CDC. I mean, it's a tough call. So I guess my first question is, before we delve into the book, how much of this did you predict?
In the book or just in general?
Just in general.
Well, I don't claim to be any kind of seer. I cover politics and I've covered it for a very long time. And my sort of side habit is to be a bit of a historian. And so at the end of the day, I hate to say that a lot of this was predictable, but an awful lot was, and an awful lot is. And one of the reasons that I decided to do the book was because of Trump and this reality of Donald Trump. And I had for many years thought about doing a book on the Republican Party, this wonderful, marvelous political entity. And it is a Republican Party, a party that was forged in the 1850s by radicals, and including socialists who really wanted to kind of break out of the political boundaries of America, and briefly did, forcing the issue of slavery, the fundamental sin of the American experiment, but also forcing land reform, the Homestead Act, and things like that. And I wanted to figure out, how did this Republican Party end up so horrific? Right. How did it become what it is? And then I realized the answer to the question wasn't in the Republican Party. The answer was in the Democratic Party. And that the Democratic Party had, and it has repeatedly over decades, failed to position itself as a party that was principled enough and visionary enough to just triumph over the Republicans. And they're look, that's the thing you have to be honest about. The Republican Party has made itself incredibly unappealing, like strikingly, shockingly unappealing, to the point where they now have Donald Trump in charge, right? And you say, well, how can you not beat these people, right? And the answer, of course, is that when you pull your punches repeatedly, not in the current moment, but over generations, and you push aside your principled leaders and you marginalize them and you marginalize their ideas, you slow the arc of history. You slow the progress, and you put yourself in a position where you are not a sufficient challenger, a sufficient opposition to, in this case, a Republican Party that's gone off the rails. And so really, that's what took me in. And so I hate to tell you that when I started writing the book, I did in fact anticipate, or at least want to explore, a deeper challenge with the Democratic Party.
So much of this book, goes back 75 years to FDR. And I mean, even if you were to anticipate this scenario, this political scenario with Bernie Sanders, I think it would be extremely hard to anticipate a situation in which the economy would collapse, potentially likely collapse, in a moment's notice because of failures in dealing with a pandemic. So, there's a lot of talk of FDR right now and Four Freedoms and Biden rising to the level of leadership needed to be an antithesis to Donald Trump at this moment, to have real solutions to get us out of this economy. I mean, there is some sort of like bare minimum that the Democrats do to keep some form of stabilization, and especially when Republicans have just gone too far. I mean, with the Iraq War is a perfect example. Barack Obama, extraordinary candidate, but probably Democrats wouldn't have done so well if the Republicans hadn't been so weak at that time and hadn't put forward such a weak candidate. So with that being said, 75 years ago, you have Henry Wallace, you have FDR. For those who are not familiar with him, can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Sure. I mean, and I think this is exactly the place to frame it. We are in a moment right now that in many senses challenges us as we have never been challenged before, but in other senses pulls together elements that we have seen many, many times. My mother is in her 80s, and I was talking to her about the coronavirus pandemic and all the challenges related to it. And she says, "Oh, I've seen this before." And I said, "Mom, you're not old enough to have been alive for the 1918 flu pandemic." And she was like, and she's very sharp. She goes, "Oh, you don't know about the 1936 epidemic of, scarlet fever in rural Wisconsin." And she started telling a story that was, social distancing, stores closed, delivering food to, her dad was a grocer, delivering food to the front steps of people who couldn't pay because they didn't have jobs. And I'm suddenly like, okay, maybe we aren't so far. And so then the question is, can politics, not government, we always talk about government. No, can politics get us to a point where we could respond sufficiently to such an overwhelming moment? Well, what happened in the 1930s was that the Democratic Party, which was a boss-driven party, and in many ways a horrible coalition, right? It had plenty of progressives in it, but it also had Southern segregationists, really bad players, big city bosses who were as crooked as can be, this whole amalgam. And they got so desperate at a certain point that they picked a son of privilege, Franklin Roosevelt. He was a wealthy guy who served a couple of years as the governor of New York, but was a good communicator. And they put him on the ballot. They had a great election. They won the House, the Senate, the presidency, swept into power. And the truth is that Roosevelt came to power as an okay guy, not the guy that we talk about now. He was okay. Right. But there were mass movements at the time, incredible movements. The movement of the unemployed, which is way underestimated. The movement of nascent labor unions. The seeds of the civil rights movement, which you can really track back into that period with the rise of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and other groups. And then one other interesting thing, a really strong socialist party. Mm-hmm. Norman Thomas got almost 1 million votes in 1932. Franklin Roosevelt was scared. He saw his left moving, and he saw his left moving outside the Democratic Party. And so Roosevelt made a lot of moves to the left. And one of the things that he did that was fascinating was he brought in a farm editor from rural Iowa, a guy who had been a La Follette progressive, who had been very involved in progressive populist movements in the upper Midwest, Henry Wallace. And Wallace was handsome, dynamic, a great intellectual. never had run for public office ever. But Roosevelt knew that he was very, very popular. He was trusted by small farmers across the Midwest because he edited a farm journal. So Roosevelt put him in charge of the Department of Agriculture. And the Department of Agriculture, I know people today would have a hard time imagining this, but it was the dynamic engine of the New Deal. It was out of the Department of Agriculture that all these rural programs and many urban programs developed. Yeah. So fast forward, in 1940, after 8 years as president, Franklin Roosevelt knew he faced an incredible challenge as he sought a third term, first president ever to do it. And he pushed aside his Southern, very conservative vice president, John Nance Garner, and he said to the Democratic Party, I will not accept your nomination for a third term unless you give me Henry Wallace as my running mate. And he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew America was headed toward World War II. He knew that we were still going to have all the economic challenges. He needed a dynamic, young, progressive, radical at his side. And what Wallace brought to that ticket, the energy, the hope, the vision, cannot be underestimated. And I won't tell you, go beyond it to a whole big story, but I'll tell you one final element. The second Wallace got in there and Roosevelt gave him a lot of role in making the war work. And he did things like say that people working in war industries needed a living wage. Mm-hmm. He supported integration of the industries. Mm-hmm. He supported treating people in other countries, farm workers in other countries who were producing products fairly and giving them a decent wage. I mean, it was just, and that so horrified the elites, the power elites within the administration, because Roosevelt had a team of rivals that they constantly manipulated to marginalize Wallace. The media went after him in all sorts of ways. But Wallace just kept on going. And his great vision was that we would beat fascism in Europe, and then we would take that energy and bring it home to America to beat racism and sexism at home. And you cannot begin to imagine the quality of the speeches he gave in 1942, 1943, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. And then when there was a race riot in Detroit in 1943, where a number of African Americans who had come into these defense industries were killed, he flew personally to Detroit, organized a rally with trade unionists, thousands of African American and Latino and white trade unionists, and told that rally, if you accept racism, if you accept segregation, if you accept violence against working class people of color coming into our industries, then you're the same as the people we're fighting against.
Right.
And that message horrified the New York Times. It horrified the elites within the party. And the bottom line story is that in 1944, and we can go deeper into it if you want, they pushed Henry Wallace aside. They marginalized him, prevented him from being the nominee for a fourth term in that fourth term for Roosevelt. And within months after that happened, Roosevelt passed. Mm-hmm. And we lost a potential president who was determined to use the post-war era immediately to fight for an end to racism, to treat the women who had gone into the factories and the Rosie the Riveters with respect, to expand the number of jobs, to have a massive housing program, and frankly, as difficult as it was, to try and seek peace with the Soviet Union rather than a Cold War.
Instead, we got Harry Truman. Thank you for watching. You can support The Nomiki Show on YouTube by clicking subscribe, like, and sharing. Because as you guys know, now more than ever, we have to support our independent media. We are being attacked from every angle, and everyone's watching CNN every night, so it's important that we take care of the good guys fighting the fight. You can also join us on Patreon for special content and interviews. We also have swag like these new mugs, starting as low as $5 a month, which is, basically what an iced coffee is in Manhattan when we had iced coffee shops open. You can go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show.